I thought it was just a sick, power-hungry game of control when my parents first cut me off from my grandmother. It wasn't until much later that I realized what was actually at stake: $30 million. At first, their reasoning sounded almost plausible. Orch. They said my grandmother, Evelyn, was getting older and tired easily, that she needed peace and quiet, and that frequent visits were only confusing her. But every word they spoke went completely against every instinct in my gut. Orch. During my very first week back in Portland after my honeymoon, my phone calls went straight to voicemail, and my iMessages were left sitting on read. The woman who raised me, the woman who had loved me more than anyone else in this world, suddenly didn't want to see me anymore. At least that's how my mother put it, her tone calm, polite, and absolute. Orch. I still remember standing in the sunlit kitchen of my craftsman bungalow in East Portland, clutching my phone and staring blankly at my reflection in the microwave door. I tried to process how a 35-year bond could be erased with a single sentence. Orch. Part of me wanted to fight back, jump into my Subaru, drive straight over to her house, and pound on that old oak door until someone gave me a real answer. Instead, a quiet, sharp instinct pulled me back. A survival mechanism honed over years of being the designated black sheep in our family. I did the last thing they ever expected. I stayed silent. That silence wasn't weakness. Orch. It was the first move in saving us both. My name is Claire Anderson, and I'm 35 years old. Growing up, I was the kid who never quite fit into the mold my parents laid out. My house has creaky wooden floors, and corners stacked high with used paperbacks from Powell's books. Orch. I built a life entirely on my own, without a single cent from my parents. Not out of pride, but because I learned early on an unwritten rule of middle-class families. In a home that demands absolute obedience, financial and emotional independence are the only ways to keep your identity intact. Orch. I had a stable career, a marriage chosen for love rather than family approval, and a habit of quietly observing people rather than speaking up. That habit ended up saving me in ways I couldn't have imagined. Orch. As I grew up, I learned the silent rules of our household without anyone ever teaching me. Don't make things complicated, don't ask too many questions, and above all, never challenge the flawless facade my parents loved to present to the world. My younger sister, Sophie, followed those rules without missing a beat. She was easygoing, agreeable, and always in the right place at the right time. Orch. I wasn't like that. The only person in that family who never asked me to tone myself down was Evelyn. At 82, age had left its mark on her, but she carried herself with a quiet certainty, the kind that comes from surviving real hardship without ever needing to brag about it. When I was a kid, her house felt like a world apart. Orch. The air always smelled of Earl Grey tea and old books, and time seemed to slow down the moment you walked through the door. She listened without interrupting, and when she did speak, every word felt deliberate and deliberate. When my parents criticized me for being too outspoken or argumentative, she would just smile, say nothing, and slip a handwritten note into my bag before I left. Orch. When Sophie was showered with praise for simply complying, leaving me sidelined, my grandmother would squeeze my hand and remind me, "Public attention isn't a measure of your worth, Claire." She never compared us, and she never asked me to change. She was the one who taught me how to read the fine print in legal documents, and how to look for what wasn't being said out loud. Orch. She warned me that whenever someone tried to rush my decisions in business or life, it usually meant they were trying to profit off my confusion. Silence, if you choose it yourself, protects you far better than screaming ever could, she once told me. Back then, I thought it was just wisdom earned over a long life. I had no idea she was quietly preparing me for the fight ahead. Orch. My parents, Mark and Linda Anderson, always proudly called themselves pragmatic. Classic boomers, they believed in efficiency, order, and doing what made practical sense. In reality, that meant a relentless need for control. Orch. My father spoke in absolute terms, disguising his personal opinions as undeniable common sense, while my mother wrapped her micromanagement in a layer of sweet concern, smiling as she set boundaries nobody asked for. They made quick decisions and expected everyone else to fall in line instantly. Sophie fit into that system seamlessly. Living just a few blocks away, she dropped by constantly, knowing exactly when to nod along and when to stay quiet. Over the years, she became the family's self-appointed interpreter, stepping in to speak for Evelyn whenever she felt it was necessary. I noticed the subtle shift, but I didn't fully understand why it made me feel so physically sick at the time. Looking back, the warning signs were there long before my wedding. But I ignored them for the sake of peace. Whenever I suggested involving my grandmother in the wedding details, my parents shut it down, claiming it would tire her out. When I asked for her opinion on seating arrangements or music, Sophie would jump in and answer for her, even with Evelyn sitting right there in the room. Every time the excuse was disguised as caring for her well-being, and every time my stomach turned. On the morning of my wedding, I naively believed everything would work out. Major life milestones, I told myself, had a way of softening friction, and celebrating love in front of everyone would make the tension fade away. I was dead wrong. All I knew then was that my grandmother meant far more to me than any superficial family image. I wanted her close, not just nearby, but right in my sightline. I wanted everyone to see what I had always known. She was my anchor. So, when my mother called a week after the wedding to calmly tell me that my grandmother needed some space from me, the ground vanished beneath my feet. What terrified me wasn't just the message itself, but how practiced it sounded. It was delivered like a rehearsed line, leaving no room for discussion. I asked to speak to her directly. They said she was resting after taking her medication. I offered to drop by quietly without disturbing her. They claimed the timing wasn't right. Later that day, Sophie texted me. In a condescending tone, she told me to respect our grandmother's wishes. She presented it as an established legal fact rather than a story manufactured for convenience. That was the moment it clicked. Nobody had actually asked my grandmother what she wanted. They were simply telling me what they wanted me to believe. So, I stepped back. I stopped calling and stopped trying to force my way through her front door. I pulled back into the shadows and began to watch. As I observed, a chilling pattern emerged. Suddenly, my parents knew my grandmother's schedule down to the exact minute. Sophie was answering her landline far more often than Evelyn was. Decisions about her life were made rapidly and without explanation, always wrapped in the polished language of necessity and care. Without concrete evidence, I could have rushed over, lost my temper, and accused them of manipulating her. But my grandmother's steady voice echoed in my head, reminding me that silence buys time. So, I waited. It was during that week that I understood the truth. My family wasn't trying to protect my grandmother at all. They were protecting something else entirely, and to keep it safe, they had no problem writing me out of the picture completely. If my parents were this determined to keep me away from her, I had to ask myself one question. What were they so afraid she might tell me? In the quiet days that followed, that question hung over me like a ghost, echoing through every empty room and lingering in the long pauses of missed calls. Every time I replayed my mother's calm words, "She needs space," I could tell those words had been polished until they sounded flawless. In hindsight, their fear hadn't appeared overnight. It had been building for years, fed by greed and resentment lurking just beneath the surface. To understand how we got here, I had to trace things back to my childhood, to the woman they could never fully dominate. When I was a little girl, my grandmother's house was my sanctuary. Tucked away on a quiet street lined with century-old oaks, it was an old single-family home that smelled like fresh tea and polished wood the second you stepped inside. The door hinges creaked every time you pushed them open, but she never oiled them. She said the sound was a reminder that nothing had to be perfect to be loved. Porch. I spent endless afternoons there after school, especially when staying at home felt like walking on eggshells. My parents demanded order. My grandmother preferred real people. She let me talk until I ran out of words, never interrupting or dismissing how I felt. Porch. When I complained about my parents constantly comparing me to Sophie, she didn't offer standard platitudes like try harder or be more understanding. She just looked at me softly and said, "You don't have to run in a race you never agreed to enter, Claire." That single sentence stayed with me longer than any advice my parents ever gave me. Porch. Even as a child, I noticed how differently the rest of the family treated her. At family dinners, my parents talked over her, finishing her sentences as if she were an actor forgetting her lines. They made choices on her behalf without asking, labeling it efficiency. But when it was just the two of us, she was sharp, observant, and quietly humorous about the world around her. Porch. She taught me practical skills most people wouldn't dream of teaching a child. How to read lengthy contracts word by word, and how to spot what was left out rather than just what was written down. She showed me how to organize tax filings and financial records, warning me never to sign anything while feeling pressured. Someone else's urgency is usually their problem, Claire. Porch. Never let it become your emergency, she'd say, tapping her finger gently against the paper. As I grew older, the massive gap between the woman my parents described and the woman she actually was became impossible to ignore. They treated her like an obligation or a burden, while I saw a fully independent, capable person. Porch. The favoritism in our family was never a secret, even though we all pretended it didn't exist. Sophie was praised for being agreeable and staying close to home. I was labeled independent, a word my parents used less as a compliment and more as a warning. When Sophie stayed quiet, she was called mature. When I asked questions, I was difficult. My grandmother refused to play those sick games. Porch. To her, we were just two different people, equally deserving of love. I remember an afternoon in my teens, sitting at her kitchen table watching her knead dough. My parents had just left after a tense visit, and I was holding back tears. Sophie had just taken credit for something I had done, and when I tried to set the record straight, I was accused of ruining the family dynamic. Porch. Without stopping her work, my grandmother said softly, "They don't like things they can't control." At the time, I thought she was talking about my stubbornness. It took years for me to realize she was talking about something much deeper. Over time, my parents' attempts to manage her grew bolder. Porch. My father started holding onto copies of her Social Security card and old financial documents under the guise of safekeeping. My mother insisted on accompanying her to routine doctor visits, even when the clinic never asked for family to be present. Sophie gradually stepped into the role of the attentive middleman, the dutiful granddaughter who somehow always knew what Evelyn needed. Porch. Yet, there was one thing they could never accomplish. They couldn't make her afraid of them. She would listen, nod, and let them believe they were in charge. Then, she would go right ahead and do exactly what she wanted anyway. Looking back, I realize how much of that was calculated on her part. She chose her battles carefully, avoiding public arguments and never embarrassing anyone. Porch. She simply refused to be rushed. In the years leading up to my wedding, the atmosphere shifted. My parents developed an unnatural fixation on her daily life. They talked endlessly about her health, throwing around terms like cognitive decline and frailty, even though her medical checkups showed no new issues. Porch. Sophie took over answering her phone calls more frequently, claiming it was easier for her. I brushed it off back then because believing their good intentions was far easier than confronting a darker truth. I wanted a simple, happy wedding free of family drama, convincing myself that whatever tension existed would blow over once the celebration was through. Porch. But there was one conversation I should have taken to heart. A few years before the wedding, my grandmother and I were sitting on her porch, watching the evening shadows stretch across the yard. She was quieter than usual. Her hands rested neatly in her lap. Out of nowhere, she said, "Claire, if there ever comes a day when they try to put distance between us, don't fight them right away." Orch. I laughed nervously, asking what she meant, assuming she was posing some dramatic hypothetical scenario. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at the time and said, "Silence will buy you time." I nodded without fully understanding, and the moment passed. Or so I thought. Orch. Years later, standing in my empty kitchen, that memory rushed back with painful clarity. She hadn't been speaking in riddles. She was preparing me for a reality she had already seen coming. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how rarely I had been allowed to see her without my family present. Orch. I hadn't noticed because it happened so slowly, carefully masked as care and convenience. My parents never outright banned me from visiting. They just made every visit endlessly complicated. There was always a reason, an excuse, a delay. If I tried to plan time alone with her, Sophie would happen to be free and insist on joining. If I called, someone else answered first. Orch. When my grandmother did speak, she was constantly interrupted, redirected, or corrected. Yet, on the rare occasions I managed to get her by herself, she was the exact same woman she had always been, clear-minded, perceptive, and fully present. That stark contrast was what finally convinced me something was deeply wrong. Orch. A person doesn't lose their judgment only when specific family members are around, nor do they suddenly become incompetent only when major decisions are on the table. I began to see why my parents were always so uneasy around her. Evelyn wasn't forgetful, she wasn't confused, and most importantly, she hadn't surrendered control of her life. Orch. They aren't afraid of her health. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. They're afraid of her choices. I didn't know what those choices involved yet, but I knew the stakes were high. By the time my parents officially declared that she didn't want to see me, I could already sense the outline of a larger scheme. Orch. I didn't have solid proof or all the answers, but I had enough history to know one thing for certain. This had nothing to do with her peace, rest, or personal space. This was a battle for control, and they had severely underestimated her. The woman they thought they could manipulate behind polite smiles and careful words had already taught me everything I needed to see through them. Orch. Standing there with the phone still in my hand, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't lose my temper. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of thinking I believed their lies. If my grandmother had chosen silence for a reason, I would honor it and play along. Orch. Because whatever my family was hiding, I had a sinking feeling it was far bigger than anything they could control. Looking back, the battle lines were drawn long before the wedding preparations even officially began, even if there hadn't been a loud declaration of war. At first, it was so subtle I wondered if I was just being paranoid. Orch. Simple questions were met with brief, hesitation-filled pauses, and stepping into a room often caused conversations to abruptly cut off. Planning a wedding is supposed to be a time of joyful chaos filled with choices about flowers, music, and guest lists. For me, it turned into something else entirely. Orch. Every time I tried to include my grandmother in even the smallest detail, an invisible force quietly pushed her aside. If I asked her opinion on the ceremony schedule, my father answered for her. Orch. If I brought up seating, my mother smiled and said, "We don't want to exhaust her." If my grandmother started to speak, Sophie would cut in gently, substituting her words with a safer, dumbed-down version. I tried telling myself they were just trying to help. Weddings bring out the control freak in everyone, and my family never knew how to take a back seat. Orch. But the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Somehow, every direct line to my grandmother was systematically blocked under the guise of looking out for her. It became glaringly obvious during an early wedding planning dinner at my parents' house, sitting around the same dining table I grew up with. Orch. I suggested my grandmother might enjoy picking out the entrance music, knowing how much she loved classic jazz and how she always spoke of dancing to it in her youth. Before my grandmother could even open her mouth, Sophie leaned forward. "Dealing with all those details will tire her out," Sophie said quickly, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "Let's just surprise her on the big day." Porch. My grandmother offered a faint smile, saying nothing. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something flickering beneath the surface. It wasn't confusion or fatigue. It was total, unwavering clarity. As the weeks passed, those moments multiplied. I'd try to set up a dress fitting, only to be told she happened to have a doctor's appointment that day. Porch. I'd offer to take her out for a quiet lunch, and my mother would insist the timing was bad because she needed rest. Somehow, Sophie always knew when my grandmother was available, even though she never actually asked her directly. What bothered me most was my parents' sudden, intense interest in her day-to-day schedule. They tracked her routine with an unsettling level of detail. Porch. My father knew her appointments down to the minute, and my mother began tracking her medications, even though my grandmother had managed them perfectly on her own for years. They framed it as dutiful care, but it felt a lot more like surveillance. The first moment that truly made my stomach drop happened on a quiet afternoon. Porch. I stopped by my parents' house unannounced to drop off some paperwork regarding the venue, assuming no one was home. Walking up the driveway, I heard my father's voice through an open window. He was on the phone, his tone low and cautious. "We need to finalize everything before she changes her mind," he said. "Keep it simple. There's no need to complicate things." Porch. I froze on the porch, my hand hovering over the doorframe, my heart hammered against my ribs. Not because I understood what he meant, but because I knew with absolute certainty I was never meant to hear it. When I stepped inside, he hung up instantly and forced a smile that came way too fast. "Didn't hear you come in?" he said. I asked him what he meant by that comment. Porch. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming it was nothing important, just routine scheduling. Before I could push further, he abruptly changed the subject to catering and flowers, acting as if the call had never happened. But it had happened, and it stayed with me like a thorn in my side. Shortly after, Sophie began stepping into a role she had never held before, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper. Porch. If I wanted to see my grandmother, I had to go through her. If I had questions, Sophie answered. If my grandmother and I were talking and Sophie walked into the room, my grandmother's voice would drop, her answers becoming brief and non-committal. The stranger part was that Sophie had never been particularly close to her. Porch. She'd visit on holidays and send flowers when expected, but she never spent hours sitting and talking with her the way I did now. She was suddenly everywhere, always helpful, always present. I did my best to hide my growing unease, telling myself wedding stress was making me hypersensitive. But an afternoon spent alone with my grandmother changed everything. Porch. I arrived at her house early, hoping to catch her before anyone else showed up. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, an unopened book in her lap. Seeing me, her face softened in that familiar way that always made me feel at home. We started with light conversation. The weather, the neighbor's new dog, the roses she was trying to keep alive in the summer heat. Porch. But beneath her words, I felt a layer of tension, a carefulness that had never been there before. Finally, I asked her if everything was all right. She hesitated for a split second before saying something that took my breath away. "They're nervous," she said quietly. I asked who she meant. Porch. Instead of answering directly, she looked at me with an intensity that suggested she was weighing something of immense importance. "If there ever comes a day when they tell you I don't want to see you," she said, "will you believe them?" The question caught me off guard. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off as a joke, but she didn't smile back. She was entirely serious. Porch. "Of course not," I replied. Yet in that moment I realized I wasn't as certain as I wanted to sound. She gave a slow nod, as if filing my answer away for later, before smoothly shifting the topic back to the wedding details. The conversation moved on, but my mind remained frozen. Over the next few days, her question played on a loop in my head. Orch. It felt less like a casual query and more like a stark warning, a prophecy I didn't fully comprehend yet. As the wedding grew closer, the walls around her tightened. When I called her house, her phone was frequently out of reach. Sophie claimed she was misplacing it constantly, though I had never known her to be careless. Orch. Important mail began arriving at my parents' house instead of hers, and my father occasionally dropped hints about helping her with paperwork, though he never offered specifics. One afternoon, I noticed a large envelope sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter at my parents' house, stamped with the logo of a law firm. Orch. When I asked about it, my mother swiftly swept it out of sight, insisting it was nothing for me to worry about. That was the moment the bigger picture finally became clear. I wasn't imagining things. These weren't random acts of family concern. This was a coordinated effort. By the time my wedding day arrived, a deep sense of dread lurked beneath my excitement. Orch. I still foolishly held on to the hope that the ceremony might bring everyone back together. That standing in a room full of witnesses would remind my family of what we were supposed to be to one another. What I didn't know then was that the wedding wouldn't heal a thing. Instead, it was about to expose everything. Looking back, I can see how carefully they set the stage. Orch. Every small redirection, every softened lie, and every intercepted conversation was a building block for something far larger. The battle before my wedding had been fought in complete silence, using weapons like smiles, care, and words like safety and responsibility. Nobody raised their voice, and nobody made overt threats. Yet the boundaries had been drawn. Orch. Though I still didn't know what my family was trying to secure, as I walked down the aisle, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The decision to cut me out of my grandmother's life had already been made. My wedding day played out like a hollow performance where everyone except me had memorized the script. Orch. From the second I woke up, I could tell the day had been mapped out, and my only role was to go along with it without asking questions. I kept trying to convince myself I was overthinking things. I got ready in a small suite at the venue, surrounded by soft lighting and the hum of hair dryers. My dress hung near the window, simple, ivory, exactly what I had wanted. Orch. Friends bustled around me adjusting details, but my eyes kept darting to the door, waiting for my grandmother to walk in. Her calm presence had always been the one thing that could ground me. She never came. When I asked my mother where she was, she just smiled and said she was resting, claiming the morning preparations had exhausted her. Orch. The excuse sounded reasonable enough, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. On important days, my grandmother was always the first one up and ready, believing that showing up early was a basic form of respect. I pushed the discomfort down and focused on the ceremony, telling myself I'd see her soon. As the music started and the guests took their seats, a tight knot pulled in my chest. Orch. My eyes scanned the rows, searching for her familiar silver hair and posture. She wasn't in the front row, nor was she anywhere along the aisle. Finally, I spotted her several rows back, half hidden behind taller guests, sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. I froze. Orch. The woman who had guided me through every major moment of my life had been tucked away near the back like an afterthought. Not next to my parents, and nowhere near a clear view of the ceremony. She looked so small in the middle of that crowd, and seeing her there cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to pause everything, walk over, take her hand, and bring her up front where she belonged. Orch. But the music swelled, the doors opened, and all eyes shifted to me. I walked down the aisle with a smile plastered on my face, my heart breaking a little more with every step. From where she sat, she had to lean over just to see me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She offered a gentle smile, the same warm look she had always given me, as if telling me it was okay. Orch. That only made it hurt worse. the ceremony blurred by vows, applause, camera flashes, and cheers. Through all of it, I was painfully aware of who was being kept at the edges of my experience. It continued straight into the reception. My grandmother was placed at a table near the back corner of the room, surrounded by distant relatives she barely knew. Porch. Meanwhile, my parents glided through the crowd with total confidence, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. Sophie worked the room, looking radiant and completely at ease. No one asked my grandmother where she wanted to sit, and no one checked to see if she was comfortable. Porch. When I tried to pull up a chair next to her, my mother cut in with a light laugh, telling me guests were waiting for photos and that we could catch up later. Every attempt I made to spend time with her was smoothly redirected. I watched Sophie lean in to speak on her behalf, answering questions before my grandmother even had a chance to open her mouth. Porch. I saw my father pat her on the shoulder in a rushed, transactional way before walking off. I saw guests looking over at her with confused expressions, unsure of her place in the family or why she was being kept at a distance. During the toasts, the exclusion became impossible to ignore. Speeches went on one after another. My parents spoke, Sophie spoke, and friends spoke. Porch. Stories were shared, and laughter filled the room. I waited for someone to invite my grandmother to say a few words. She knew me longer than almost anyone there and had real stories to tell. Nobody called her up. When someone finally mentioned her name in passing, it was framed merely as a polite note of gratitude for her attendance. She nodded gracefully, her smile tight. Porch. A wave of anger washed over me, and I had to swallow a glass of champagne just to keep it down. Later, as the music turned up and people moved to the dance floor, I searched for her again. She was sitting alone, watching the celebration from a distance with a glass of water in her hands. Couples spun under the lights while laughter echoed through the room. Porch. After a quick dance with my partner, I excused myself, set on spending real time with her. Before I could reach her table, Sophie stepped into my path, telling me our grandmother was tired and that it was best to let her rest. She said it politely, but there was an underlying firmness that felt entirely staged. Looking past her, I saw my parents watching us, their expressions carefully neutral. Porch. I didn't argue. I just nodded and allowed myself to be led away, my chest aching over the fact that I was going along with it. Near the end of the night, I finally managed to sit beside her in quiet for a few precious minutes. The room was buzzing around us, but she seemed completely untroubled by it. I apologized for not being able to spend more time with her. Porch. She squeezed my hand, telling me not to worry, and that she was proud of me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried something else. Not sadness, but total awareness. When she stood up to leave, I noticed she didn't have her own car. My father mentioned that he and Sophie would be driving her home. Something felt off, but the day had left me completely drained. Porch. I kissed her cheek and promised to call her the next morning. She held my gaze for a long moment before walking away, as if engraving my face into her memory. As the guests filed out and the lights dimmed, I felt hollow. The joy everyone kept talking about felt completely out of reach. I tried telling myself I was just exhausted and overly emotional from the day. Porch. Yet, on the drive home, a heavy sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I called my grandmother's house. It went straight to voicemail. I left a light, cheerful message asking how she was feeling. She didn't call back. I tried again that afternoon. This time, Sophie answered. She told me our grandmother was resting and promised to pass the message along. Porch. Days drifted by, and every attempt to reach her was met with another excuse. She was sleeping, she was at an appointment, or she simply didn't feel up to talking that day. When I finally got my mother on the phone directly, she delivered the sentence that shattered everything. Porch. She told me, in a soft tone as if doing us all a favor, that my grandmother needed some space away from me, claiming it was simply for the best. I hung up and sat in the dead silence of my home, replaying every detail of the wedding in my head. The deliberate seating, the the cut-off conversations, and the decisions made without her consent. Every piece of the puzzle locked into place with terrifying, crystal-clear precision. The ceremony hadn't brought us together. It was the moment they went public. By sidelining my grandmother that day, they showed me where they thought she belonged. And by cutting me off immediately after, they made it clear they expected me to accept it quietly. They were dead wrong. Standing alone in my kitchen at that moment, I didn't know yet how I would react. I only knew this exclusion was no accident. It was calculated, and whatever their next move was, the wheels were already turning. The dead silence that followed the wedding was heavier than anything before it. There was no dramatic blowout, no screaming, and no doors slamming, just a lingering absence that seeped into my daily routine. I woke up every morning, expecting to see my grandmother Evelyn's name on my phone, even if it was just a quick text asking how married life was treating me or reminding me to eat breakfast. Instead, there was nothing. At first, I tried telling myself she was just exhausted. Weddings are long and draining after all, and if they wear out younger people, they would certainly take a toll on someone her age. I sent a gentle text, and another the next day. Silence. When I called, it rang until it went straight to voicemail. My voice in those messages sounded far too cheerful, less about making her happy and more about desperately trying to convince myself that everything was fine. By the third day, I knew something was terribly wrong. Every attempt I made to reach her ended the same way, either complete silence, or Sophie answering the phone in that rehearsed, sugar-coated tone that made my skin crawl. Grandma's resting. Grandma just stepped out. Grandma isn't up for talking today. What unnerved me most was the sheer certainty in Sophie's voice. There was no hesitation or genuine concern, just absolute confidence, as if she possessed complete insight into my grandmother's thoughts and needs, even though Evelyn hadn't spoken a single word to me herself. On the fourth day, I bumped into my mother at Whole Foods. We exchanged polite greetings in the aisle between produce and dairy, like two strangers trying not to draw attention from shoppers around us. I casually asked if she'd heard from my grandmother lately. She smiled and said, "Oh, she's doing just fine. She's just enjoying some quiet time to herself. You know how she is." I did know how she was, and to her, quiet time never meant cutting off the granddaughter she spoke with almost every single day. Right then and there, a terrifying lie began to take shape in my mind. A few days later, I went to my parents' house to pick up a coat I'd left behind. Walking in, I overheard my mother on the phone. She didn't realize I was there yet, and her voice carried down the hallway, soft but unmistakably clear. "Claire's been so busy since the weddings," she said. "New life, new priorities, it's only natural." I froze in place, my car keys gripped tightly in my hand. Busy? New priorities? The words sounded harmless, almost forgiving, but they were a complete fabrication. I hadn't stepped back. I was being shoved away. When she spotted me, she ended the call quickly, forcing a warm smile and asking if I needed anything. I didn't confront her right there. I couldn't yet. I just nodded and left, my chest tight from the realization that my story was being deliberately rewritten behind my back. Over the next week, that narrative began circulating among our relatives and friends. Sophie told a neighbor she ran into that I was busy adjusting to married life and didn't have much time to visit family anymore. A longtime family friend casually mentioned hearing that I was giving Grandma some personal space. Every time I heard a new version of the story, my stomach sank. They were spinning a calculated narrative, one where I was the cold, distant granddaughter who neglected her family for her own life, while my grandmother was being dutifully cared for by everyone else. My absence was being framed as my choice. Slowly, painfully, the lie was working. The only direct call I had with my grandmother during that period happened unexpectedly one afternoon. My phone rang, and when I saw her name on the screen, my heart leaped into my throat. I picked up instantly, my voice trembling with relief I couldn't hide. "Grandma!" There was a pause on the line. Then her voice came through, softer and far more cautious than usual. "Hello, dear." Orch. I immediately launched into a string of unnecessary apologies, telling her I'd been trying to reach her and asking how she was doing. She listened in silence. When I finished, she spoke a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You're very busy right now," she said. "I don't want to bother you." It wasn't just what she said that terrified me. It was how she said it. It didn't sound like her at all. Orch. It sounded like a script someone had forced her to recite. Before I could reply, I heard a faint murmur in the background. It was Sophie whispering softly. Though the words were too muffled to make out, the proximity was unmistakable. "Claire," my grandmother said, her tone suddenly guarded. "I have to go. We'll talk another time." The line went dead, leaving a dial tone echoing in my ear. Orch. I sat there staring at my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was active surveillance and control. For the first time, the dark fear lingering in my mind became real. What if they actually succeeded in making her believe I didn't care anymore? What if the one person who had trusted me unconditionally now truly thought I had abandoned her? Orch. That night, I couldn't eat or sleep. I replayed every interaction over the past month. Every redirected topic, every cut-off conversation. The pieces fit together with terrifying precision. A few days later, driven half by desperation and half by instinct, I went over to my parents' house, unannounced once again. Porch. Sophie was there, sitting at the kitchen table with my grandmother's purse right beside her hand. Evelyn herself was in the living room, watching television with the volume turned down low. I noticed immediately that whenever I asked my grandmother how she was doing, Sophie was the one who answered. My grandmother just nodded along with a weak smile, keeping silent. Porch. On the coffee table sat a thick folder I hadn't seen before. It was much bulkier than standard medical paperwork, its edges bound neatly. When I asked what it was, Sophie closed it without hesitation and said, "Nothing important." Nothing important. Later, while helping my grandmother to the bathroom, I asked her softly if everything was okay. She hesitated before giving a small nod. Porch. But her eyes darted nervously toward the hallway, looking toward the kitchen where Sophie and my parents were talking in low tones. "I don't want to cause trouble," she whispered. Those words hit me harder than any direct accusation ever could. Evelyn had spent her entire life standing her ground, never shying away from necessary conflict to protect what was right. Porch. Hearing her say that made me realize the overwhelming pressure she was under. As I prepared to leave that evening, I overheard my father say something to Sophie that confirmed my worst fears. "Once everything is settled," he said, "it'll be much easier on her." Settled. That word echoed in my mind all the way home. Porch. In this context, settled meant decided, locked down, and stripped from her hands. I began to see that this was more than just an attempt to emotionally isolate us. It was a calculated plan to strip away her ability to make her own choices, shrinking her world until the only voices she could hear were theirs. Porch. My fear settled into a crystal-clear realization. They weren't just lying to me. They were making final preparations for something much larger. I didn't know the exact details yet, but I knew it involved legal documents, authorizations, and forced decisions framed as for her own good. I'd seen these scenarios in news stories and documentaries. Porch. I knew how easily legal mechanisms could be used to mask an appalling takeover of someone's life. Long after the sun went down that night, I sat alone in my dark living room in absolute silence. I realized that if they succeeded, a day would come when Evelyn would no longer be free to speak with me at all. Every word would be filtered, every choice intercepted, every connection monitored. Porch. If that happened, no amount of anger or confrontation afterward could ever undo the damage. They weren't just taking her away from me. They were systematically erasing her independence. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped holding on to the illusion that things would fix themselves. Hope wasn't enough anymore. Whatever they were planning, I had to see her again. Porch. I needed to hear the truth directly from her mouth, not through the story spun by the people surrounding her. Because beneath all the lies and forced smiles, there was a reason my family was acting with such frantic urgency, and I was beginning to understand that it had nothing to do with love. It was all about control. The next morning, I didn't tell a soul I was going to see her. Porch. I didn't send a text or call ahead. I had learned my lesson. In this family, any advance notice traveled at lightspeed ski and arrived completely distorted. Instead, I drove across town early in the morning, arriving at her house before their tight surveillance network could settle into her daily routine. I wasn't going to give anyone the chance to decide she was too tired for visitors today. Porch. Her house looked the same as always, quiet and dignified, with the curtains half drawn to let in the soft morning light. When she opened the door and saw me standing on the porch, the expression on her face changed in a way I'll never forget. First came intense relief, followed by sharp vigilance, and finally, absolute resolve. "You came alone," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Porch. She stepped aside to let me in, then deliberately and carefully turned the deadbolt behind us. That simple action told me everything I needed to know. We sat at the small kitchen table, where we had shared countless cups of tea over the years. She poured tea slowly, her hand steady and precise. Porch. Despite everything my family tried to convey about her being frail and confused, the woman sitting in front of me was nothing like their descriptions. "They think I don't see what they're doing," she said quietly before I even had the chance to speak. Porch. The words came out like a long sigh between us, and I felt a knot of tension release in my chest. A knot I hadn't even realized I was holding so tightly. I wasn't imagining things. She knew everything. I laid out the entire picture. The unanswered calls, the lies I overheard, the way Sophie answered for her, and the suspicious folder on my parents' coffee table. Porch. I mentioned the phone call where she sounded like a stranger in her own life, and the quiet whisper I heard from Sophie in the background. She didn't interrupt me once, her eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, she let out a long breath. "They're being very careful," she said. "It's not loud or obvious cruelty, it's subtle and unspoken. That's why they think they can get away with it." Porch. She described the subtle tactics I hadn't been there to see. How her phone frequently went missing, only to be conveniently found and handed back to her later. How medical appointments were scheduled without her input and explained away afterward. And how every conversation was manipulated to make her second-guess her own memory. "They keep using the word safety," she said. Porch. "They emphasize how complicated things get at my age, and how worried they are that I'll make a mistake." A faint, humorless smile touched the corners of her mouth. "They aren't worried about me making a mistake. They're terrified of me making my own choices." The truth landed heavily in the room. For a moment, neither of us said a word. Porch. Then she reached for a thin folder sitting on the edge of the table that I hadn't even noticed until now. She didn't open it right away, resting her hand quietly on top of it, as if gathering her strength. "There's something you need to know," she said. I felt my pulse quicken. "I didn't tell you before because I didn't want to burden you," she continued. Porch. "And I didn't tell them because I wanted to see how they would act when they thought there was nothing in it for them." She opened the folder and slid a single document across the table to me. I quickly scanned the first page, then the second. When my eyes caught the key details, my breath caught in my throat. Land deed. Montana. 2,400 acres. I looked up at her in shock. Porch. She studied my face carefully, gauging the impact of the revelation. "It's land that's been passed down through generations," she said quietly. "It was kept quiet, held in my name for many years." My eyes moved to the bottom of the page, where the estimated valuation made my vision blur. $30 million. I leaned back hard against my chair, stunned by the sheer weight of the reveal. Porch. My parents' sudden urgency, the suffocating control, the carefully woven lies. Everything snapped into sharp focus. To them, That land isn't just money, she whispered. It's complete power. She explained that she kept it quiet not to hide anything unlawfully, but to avoid being treated like an asset. Orch. She wanted to live a normal life and see who actually cared about her when there was no massive inheritance dangling in front of them. They always knew something existed, she said. They just didn't know the full extent of it. That uncertainty is what made them so restless. Orch. I finally understood why they were moving so fast, why the pressure kept escalating, and why those legal documents were being pushed so urgently. She looked across the table at me, her gaze steady. I chose you. I swallowed hard. Not because you're perfect, she said, but because you never tried to manage me. You ask my opinion, you listen, and you respect my right to make my own decisions. Orch. My throat tightened. I didn't want them to make you a target, she added. If they had known how much was involved from the start, they would have come after you much sooner. That realization sent a chill down my spine. The lies weren't just meant to isolate her. They were designed to eliminate me from the picture before I even realized what was happening. Orch. With this new clarity, we pieced the whole strategy together. The manipulated schedules, the fabricated stories, the mysterious legal files. It all pointed toward a single objective: using legal mechanisms like power of attorney or conservatorship under the guise of elder care to strip away her authority before she could act on her own terms. Orch. They still don't know the full value of the asset, she said. At least, not yet. Part of me wanted to march straight over to my parents' house, demand answers, throw the truth in their faces, and watch them panic. When I voiced the thought, my grandmother gently shook her head. If we move too quickly, she said, they'll resort to harsher measures. Orch. She explained that chosen silence could serve as our shield. Confronting them prematurely would only raise the alarm, forcing them to push their plans through before we were fully prepared. We tell them nothing, she said firmly. Not a word about the land, and not a word about our plans. I nodded. Though my emotions were churning, I completely understood the tactical necessity. Orch. We keep watching, she continued. We gather proof and we prepare to take our stand. It felt strange sitting there discussing strategy with her like allies rather than just grandmother and granddaughter, but it also felt entirely right. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel helpless. I felt a sense of responsibility and a deep, empowering trust. Orch. As I stood up to leave, she took my hand, her grip far stronger than anyone would expect. Whatever happens, she said, remember this: silence isn't surrender. It's positioning. I drove home with the weight of the truth sitting in the passenger seat. My family thought they could manipulate this woman like a puppet, completely unaware that she had been reading them the entire time. Orch. And the legacy they were circling like vultures wasn't just land or money. It was the power to decide what happens next. As I pulled into my driveway, one thing became crystal clear. My family wasn't just targeting my grandmother. They were targeting my future. And now that I knew what was truly on the line, I wasn't going to let them decide the outcome for either of us. Orch. When silence shifted from an imposed punishment into a deliberate tactic, its entire nature transformed. Before, silence felt like a wall built around me brick by brick, keeping me trapped. But leaving my grandmother's house that morning with the secret of that 2,400-acre Montana ranch, silence became a weapon. Orch. It was my only way to stay one step ahead of a family that assumed I was still confused, emotional, and easy to manipulate. I didn't rush to confront my parents. I didn't call Sophie to call out her games. I didn't drop even the smallest hint that I knew the real stakes. Orch. Instead, I stepped seamlessly back into the role they expected me to play. A millennial newlywed wrapped up in her own world. A daughter too busy with work and a mortgage to pry into family affairs. And a granddaughter who stopped asking sharp questions and trusted her elders completely. They mistook my calm for ignorance. Orch. After leaving my grandmother's house, my first phone call wasn't to my husband or a friend. I called an attorney named Jennifer Lee. My grandmother had mentioned her years ago during a casual conversation, describing her as a top-tier lawyer who understood complex family dynamics just as deeply as she mastered trust and estate law. Torch. On the call, I kept details minimal, simply stating that I needed legal guidance regarding protecting an older relative from non-consensual loss of autonomy. Jennifer asked a few sharp, precise questions and invited me to her office for a consultation. Torch. Her office in Portland's Pearl District didn't feature flashy displays of wealth, but the quiet, understated setting carried an unmistakable atmosphere of professionalism. Torch. As I laid out the timeline on her walnut desk, the deliberate isolation, the subtle pressure disguised as care, the sudden appearance of legal files, and the rewritten narrative, she sat with her hands folded, listening intently without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair. Torch. "This isn't a routine family disagreement," she said, her voice as precise as a scalpel. "In legal terms, this is elder financial exploitation, and they are already moving into very dangerous operational territory." Hearing those words defined so clearly, in legal terms, sent a jolt through me, validating every instinct I had been wrestling with for weeks. Torch. Jennifer broke down how this process typically unfolds in middle-class hat families. First comes emotional isolation, cutting off the elder from their most trusted contacts. Next comes gaslighting, making them doubt their memory and ability to manage their affairs. Then comes artificial urgency. Torch. Finally, it all culminates in legal documents presented as protection or for their own good. Usually a broad, durable power of attorney or a petition for conservatorship. "If they sense any resistance from your grandmother," she warned, "they will accelerate the process, possibly even seeking medical opinions from compliant doctors to declare her incapacitated." Torch. Together, we quietly mapped out a counter-strategy. Jennifer began building a legal firewall around my grandmother's assets behind the scenes. Without drawing outside attention, we moved to establish an irrevocable trust, securing the Montana land and her core assets safely out of reach. We prepared explicit intent documents setting clear boundaries. Torch. If anyone attempted to claim authority over her without legal grounds, they would face severe legal consequences. Every step was handled with extreme confidentiality. No mail was sent to my parents' address, and no suspicious bank movements were made that could trigger their suspicion. Jennifer emphasized that timing and preparation were everything. Torch. "Right now they are convinced they're winning," Jennifer said, looking me in the eye. "Let them keep thinking that." So, I returned to the family group chats, playing the compliant role perfectly. When my mother called for her routine check-ins, I sounded distracted but polite. Torch. When Sophie texted updates about my grandmother's schedule, I replied with a grateful emoji, thanking her for keeping me in the loop. When my father casually mentioned he was handling tedious paperwork so Grandma wouldn't have to worry, I nodded along, saying I completely trusted their judgment. At first, playing along with a script built on lies made me sick to my stomach. Torch. But as the days went on, things played out exactly as Jennifer predicted. The more confident they felt, the more careless they became. They started letting details slip. Their timeline accelerated. Sophie began dropping mentions of non-existent cognitive evaluation appointments in texts. Torch. My mother talked openly about streamlining family financial responsibilities. My father frequently used words like finalizing and settling, as if the final outcome had already been decided and was merely awaiting execution. Not once did any of them ask my grandmother what she wanted, nor did they ask for my input. In their minds, it wasn't necessary. Torch. They were convinced they held total control. I documented everything: dates, times, exact phrases, who initiated conversations, and who interrupted whom. Jennifer advised me to save every text screenshot and voicemail. Not for immediate court use, but because in cases of subtle exploitation, establishing a clear pattern of behavior is far more compelling than isolated incidents. Torch. My grandmother was keeping track in her own way, too. She didn't write things down, but she held every conversation in her mind with striking clarity, recounting the exact phrasing and pauses to me later. When people assume your memory is no longer a threat, they severely underestimate its power, she remarked dryly one day. Ouch. What struck me most that week was watching my grandmother transform from a passive target into a brilliant strategist. She stopped resisting them on minor details, instead leaning into the false persona they had constructed for her. Frail, confused, and vulnerable. When they explained things to her, she deliberately asked them to repeat themselves. She displayed subtle moments of hesitation at key times. She even took my mother's hand, thanking her frail-sounding voice for looking out for her. Her act fueled their confidence completely. One afternoon, my father called me. In a casual tone, he mentioned they were thinking about bringing in a professional to help simplify a few matters. He made it sound like hiring a plumber to fix a sink. A routine favor done entirely for her benefit. When I played along, asking out of curiosity what kind of professional he meant, he paused briefly before uttering the phrase, "a mobile notary." That single phrase confirmed all of Jennifer's predictions. Mobile notary visits are frequently used by individuals attempting to rush property or authority transfers, lending legal weight to documents signed under pressure, especially after setting a backdrop that the elder is losing capacity. Bringing in a notary meant they believed my grandmother was fully compliant and ready to sign away her rights. I passed the information to Jennifer immediately. Her response was swift and composed. "Good," she said. "That means they're ready to show their hand." Behind the scenes, Jennifer alerted an investigator specializing in elder financial exploitation at Adult Protective Services, APS, to stand by. No formal report was filed yet. It was a countermeasure held in reserve for the exact moment we needed it. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the family grew heavy with anticipation. Sophie's texts became relentless, bordering on a campaign of fatigue. My mother repeatedly hinted that time was running out. My father explicitly stated, "We need to get this done while her mind is still clear." Clear. Every time I heard that word, a wave of nausea hit me. Clear for whose benefit, exactly? Sitting alone in my living room after another phone call filled with false concern, I felt the weight of the coming storm. This fight had grown far beyond $30 million or a stretch of land. It was a defense of human dignity, a battle over whether my grandmother would continue to live as an autonomous person or be reduced to an asset to be managed, and whether I was an equal family member or just an obstacle to be swept aside. I had imagined rushing over, confronting them, and experiencing the immediate satisfaction of exposing the truth. But I held on to my grandmother's words about tactical positioning, allowing them to reach the peak of their arrogance, so their actions would be entirely undeniable before facing the consequences. So, I stayed silent. That silence gave them blind confidence, and that confidence made them careless. A few days later, Sophie accidentally mentioned in a text that the notary's schedule was tight. My father added pressure, saying they needed to wrap things up immediately. My mother let out a long sigh, noting that once the paperwork was handled, she could finally breathe easy. Handled, I could feel the stillness in the air that precedes a heavy storm. I knew the moment was approaching when they would show up with polite smiles and legal documents in hand, fully expecting compliance, gratitude, and a signature. That evening, my grandmother and I sat in her house drinking tea, the room so quiet you could hear the steady tick of the clock. She reached out, taking my hand in hers and giving it a firm squeeze. "They think their next visit will end all of this," she said softly. I met her eyes with total certainty. "It will end," I replied, "just not the way they're expecting." For the first time since my wedding, a sense of profound calm settled over me. It wasn't because the danger was gone, but because I was no longer standing by helplessly. I was ready. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were about to learn, at a brutal cost, that in this moment, silence was simply the net closing in around them. The day they arrived with the documents came without warning, wrapped in polite greetings and rehearsed concern. My father called that morning, his tone unusually gentle. Porch. He mentioned they wanted to drop by to help Evelyn simplify a few small matters. He spoke as if performing an act of noble charity that was long overdue. I agreed immediately, keeping my voice calm and composed. When I hung up, my hands were completely steady. By the time I reached my grandmother's house, she was already dressed and sitting in her usual armchair by the window. Porch. She looked smaller and more frail than usual. Not out of weakness, but because she had mastered the art of appearing like vulnerable prey when the situation called for it. When I asked if she was ready, she gave a firm nod and whispered, "Let them speak." They arrived right on time, down to the minute. Porch. My father stepped through the door first, wearing a relaxed smile as if arriving for a casual Sunday brunch. But behind his stride was the arrogance of someone preparing to finalize a major deal. My mother followed closely behind, carrying a large tote bag over her shoulder containing the legal documents she pretended were completely harmless. Porch. Sophie was right behind them, her shoulders rigid with intense expectation. Behind the three of them walked a man I didn't recognize. Dressed in a sharp suit, he held a black leather briefcase like an emblem of authority. "This is the notary," Sophie announced, her tone so unnaturally bright, it sounded absurd, as if she were introducing a long-lost relative bearing gifts. Porch. The notary offered a polite nod. When he spoke, it carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to operating in these murky waters. He was all too familiar with rooms like this, places where an elderly person was backed into a corner by expectant eyes, pressured into giving up their independence for the sake of family harmony. Porch. He claimed he was there to help streamline the process and ensure everything was properly executed. He framed it as a massive favor. Without waiting for an invitation, they made themselves at home on the sofa. Several documents were laid out on the coffee table with practiced precision. My father cleared his throat, taking the lead. His tone was gentle, almost proud. "Porch. Mom, we're just here today to wrap up what we discussed earlier," he said. "That way you can finally relax and enjoy your golden years." Relax. The notary opened his briefcase, retrieving a thick stack of forms, an official seal, and an expensive blue ink pen. He set them neatly in front of my grandmother. Porch. In the sunlight filtering through the blinds, the pen caught the light with a cold metallic glint, like a blade poised to fall, carrying an overwhelming sense of finality. My mother leaned in close. "Mom, we know all of this has been overwhelming for you lately," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Once this is signed, everything gets so much simpler. Porch. You won't have to worry about a single thing." Sophie nodded, seamlessly taking over before my grandmother could even utter a word. She began running through the terms in broad, hurried strokes, speaking as if to a toddler. She glossed completely over the key clauses regarding the relinquishment of financial authority, her finger tracing repetitive circles over the signature lines. Porch. Her delivery was slow and overly patient, that distinctive condescension reserved for people who believe they hold absolute intellectual superiority in the room. My grandmother raised her head slightly, asking in a frail voice what would happen if she changed her mind later. It wasn't my family who answered her, but the notary. Porch. His response was wrapped in dense legal jargon that sounded reassuring on the surface while completely dodging the core question. He spoke at length about safeguards and standard procedures, emphasizing how extremely common this type of family arrangement was in the country. Common for whom? The opportunists? Porch. When the pen was pushed directly against my grandmother's fingers, a heavy stillness settled over the room. Everyone instinctively leaned forward, as if physical proximity alone could force her compliance. Sophie held a triumphant smile. My father crossed his arms, waiting. My mother stared intently at my grandmother's face, braced for the expected, purely symbolic hesitation. Orch. My grandmother reached out slowly toward the paperwork. Her hand trembled right on cue, perfectly validating every assumption they held about her declining capacity. That was the exact moment I spoke up. "I have a question," I said quietly. In an instant, every head snapped toward me. Shock, confusion, and poorly concealed annoyance flickered across their faces. Orch. In their rush to finalize control, they had completely forgotten I was standing right there. Ignoring my parents' murderous glares, I turned straight to the notary. "If my grandmother signs this agreement and later decides she wants to reclaim full control over her financial and medical decisions, can this irrevocable authorization be easily voided?" The notary froze. Orch. He hesitated, shifting his gaze toward my father as if looking for a cue. Before offering a response, his answer was overly cautious, packed with rigid technicalities, and ultimately sidestepped the question entirely. Sophie's forehead creased. My mother let out a heavy, disapproving sigh. My father adopted the stern tone he used when reprimanding subordinates. "Orch. Claire, there's no need to drag us into impossible hypotheticals right now. Hypotheticals are the only thing that matter before signing away personal autonomy," I fired back coolly. The notary cleared his throat awkwardly, attempting to regain control of the room by suggesting everyone move forward with the process. Once again, he nudged the heavy document toward my grandmother. Orch. Just as her fingers brushed the paper, a knock echoed from the front entry. It wasn't a light, casual knock from a neighbor. It was a deliberate, steady, unmistakably authoritative knock. The entire room went rigid. "I didn't realize we were expecting anyone else today," the notary blurted out, the polished composure slipping from his voice for the first time, replaced by genuine agitation. "Orch." My grandmother calmly withdrew her hand and lifted her head. When she spoke, the frailty was entirely gone. Her voice was crystal clear, firm, and completely shattered the helpless persona they had relied on. "That's my appointment," she said evenly. I walked over and pulled open the heavy oak door. Standing on the porch was Jennifer Lee, dressed in a sharp dark gray suit. Orch. Right behind her stood a broad-shouldered investigator from County Adult Protective Services, an official badge displayed prominently on his chest. Both carried the unshakable, level-headed demeanor of professionals who had seen the worst of family greed. "Good afternoon," Jennifer announced, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "I am the legal representative for Evelyn Anderson." Orch. In that single second, the tension in the room imploded. My father bolted to his feet. So fast he knocked his chair backward, its legs screeching against the hardwood floor. The practiced, confident smile vanished from my mother's face, leaving her ghost white. Sophie's fingers dug into the edge of the coffee table, her knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. Orch. The once composed notary snapped his leather briefcase shut in a knee-jerk reaction. His polished demeanor completely evaporated, replaced by raw panic. He knew that if a notary became entangled in elder financial coercion, it didn't just mean losing a license. It meant facing severe legal accountability. Orch. "I am an investigator with County Adult Protective Services," the broad-shouldered man announced calmly, displaying his credentials. His tone was entirely neutral, yet carried the unmistakable weight of official authority. "Based on serious allegations regarding potential elder financial exploitation, I am present today as an official, independent observer to document these proceedings." Orch. Those cold, objective words stripped away the illusion of family care they had built so carefully. Confronted with a state official, their usual tactics of emotional leverage and gaslighting collapsed instantly. Jennifer Lee stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the unsigned power of attorney on the table. Orch. "Before any document is executed." Jennifer's voice echoed sharply through the space. "My client has an absolute right to independent legal counsel and to make decisions with full understanding of the legal consequences. No one in this room will exert pressure on her." The notary wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, stammering as he tried to backpedal. I wasn't aware of any dispute here. Orch. I was simply hired to. The investigator raised a hand, cutting him off smoothly. I have a few questions first, he said. He turned toward Sophie, his gaze sharp. Who prepared these documents? Sophie stumbled over her words, her usual quick wit abandoning her completely. It was our family. She tried to pivot quickly. The family arranged this together for our grandmother. Orch. The investigator made a rapid note on his pad without looking up. Who requested the notary visit today? My father swallowed hard, attempting to project calm. This was a collective decision. We are only acting in my mother's best interest. The investigator stopped writing and looked directly into my grandmother's eyes. Miss Orch. Anderson, did you personally request the preparation of these legal documents? Did you ask to transfer your financial authority? Silence gripped the room. My parents stared at her, their eyes filled with desperate pleading masked under veiled tension. My grandmother didn't even look at them. Orch. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing out steady, strong, and clear, completely obliterating the narrative of frailty they had spent months cultivating. I never requested this. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. The investigator nodded, continuing his notes. Orch. He proceeded to methodically question every detail of what had just transpired, asking about the pressure applied to obtain a signature, the manufactured sense of urgency, and the constant framing that she was no longer capable of handling her own affairs. With every question, the elaborate storyline my family had spent months constructing fell apart piece by piece. Orch. The notary looked like he was sitting on pins and needles, his professional composure entirely gone. Sophie tried to offer an explanation, but her voice came out sharp, defensive, and desperate. My mother reached out instinctively toward my grandmother's arm, attempting one last appeal to family ties. My grandmother calmly pulled her hand away. Orch. At that moment, Jennifer Lee placed a small digital recorder on the coffee table and pressed play. The room was instantly filled with familiar voices from the past few weeks. This is for your safety. It's just to simplify things. Don't worry about the fine print, we'll handle it. We need to move while her mind is still clear. Every phrase landed like a physical blow. Orch. My father's face flushed crimson. Sophie stared fixedly at the floor in humiliation. My mother covered her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. These proceedings are now officially documented, the investigator said, stopping the recording with an unyielding tone. Based on what has transpired here, there are strong grounds to suspect coercive execution. Orch. The notary stood up abruptly, desperate to distance himself. This is a complete misunderstanding. I'm leaving immediately. Please remain seated, sir, the investigator instructed firmly. No one leaves this room until I have completed my inquiry. Jennifer exchanged a brief look with me before turning to my grandmother. Orch. Evelyn, regarding the matter you mentioned earlier, is there anything you would like to share with everyone present? My grandmother nodded. She reached beside her chair for the thin folder I had prepared for her that morning. Moving with measured, deliberate grace, she drew out the document and placed it directly in the center of the coffee table. Orch. This is an official legal copy of the deed to the family ranch in Montana, she said, enunciating every word clearly, totaling approximately 2,400 acres. My father's jaw dropped. Sophie snapped her head up, her eyes wide with shock. My mother let out a faint gasp, as if struck in the chest. Jennifer took over, her tone entirely matter-of-fact. Orch. According to the latest independent assessment, the current market value of the property and its land sits at approximately $30 million. Please note, this does not include other liquid assets held within the trust. $30 million. The figure detonated in the living room like a bomb, dropping the space into complete, deafening silence. Orch. My grandmother's gaze moved coolly across the three of them, resting on my father, my mother, and then Sophie. The reason I kept this asset confidential. Her weathered voice carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen through the worst of human nature. Was to see who would still respect my choices when they believed there was nothing left to gain from me. Orch. The notary slumped back into his chair, realizing his professional standing was severely compromised. The investigator recorded every detail without a word. Sophie's carefully curated demeanor shattered entirely, her face twisted with a mix of shock, humiliation, and bitter regret over an inheritance completely out of reach. Orch. My father opened his mouth to speak, trying to offer an excuse or spin the situation back into a well-meaning misunderstanding. Jennifer cut him off without hesitation, her voice firm as steel. This meeting is over. Moving forward, you are barred from making any direct contact with my client. All future communications must go through my firm. Orch. Any attempt to violate this boundary will result in an immediate application for a protection order. The investigator rose, thanking my grandmother politely for her cooperation. He then turned to my family, his expression stern with explicit warning, as he outlined the next legal steps. Words like consequences and formal review hung heavy in the air over them. Orch. They departed in suffocating silence. Gone was the confidence they arrived with, stripped of their control and authority. They quietly exited through the old oak door. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, my grandmother let out a long, deep breath. She leaned back into her chair, looking as though a mountain had been lifted from her shoulders. She reached out and squeezed my hand tightly. Orch. They came here expecting to finalize their control over my life, she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. They never realized they were simply exposing their own true intentions to the light. I looked around the room, the untouched pen, the scattered legal forms on the table, and the shattered illusion of family control. The storm that had hovered over us for months had finally broken. Orch. For the first time since this began, the air felt clear. The old house felt transformed, as if the walls themselves were finally breathing again. The quiet was no longer heavy. It felt clean and free. That afternoon, Jennifer remained behind to methodically organize the documents they had brought, taking high-resolution photos of the evidence for our records while explaining the roadmap ahead. Orch. The APS investigator returned to his office to draft his official report. What lay ahead were formal inquiries, interviews, and requests for documentation. Not a sensationalized scene, but the slow, methodical, and unyielding process of accountability. They banked entirely on your continued silence, Claire, Jennifer noted, looking over at my grandmother. Orch. Now it's their turn to sit with the consequences. By evening, the inevitable fallout began to surface. My phone vibrated endlessly. My mother called first. Watching her name flash across the screen, I declined the call. Then came a barrage of texts from Sophie, followed by more missed calls. Orch. My father left a voicemail. The authority in his voice was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, shaky tone as he pleaded for a sit-down, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding, and that they were only acting out of concern. I didn't reply. Jennifer had explicitly instructed us to avoid direct contact. Beyond that, neither my grandmother nor I had anything left to say to them. Orch. Everything that needed to be said had already been established in that living room. Over the next few days, the progress was steady and definitive. The unshakable control my parents had assumed completely evaporated. Their messages shifted rapidly from condescending assertions to sheer panic, and finally to defensive deflection. Sophie's texts were packed with contradictory justifications. Orch. My grandmother looked at the messages once before passing the phone back to me. An apology that only arrives after a scheme is exposed is meaningless, she said quietly. By Wednesday, an official letter arrived at Jennifer's office from a high-priced defense attorney my parents had hurriedly retained. Orch. The letter was filled with formal language, attempting to reframe everything as noble intentions, a family miscommunication, and a deep commitment to elder welfare. Jennifer reviewed the letter, a sharp, cold smile touching her lips. Classic damage control, she said, tossing the paper onto her desk. Not a shred of genuine remorse. Orch. She immediately dispatched a formal cease and desist warning in response. The letter made it clear that all future interactions were strictly limited to legal representatives, and that any further attempts to pressure my grandmother or misrepresent her wishes would be submitted directly to the court as evidence of ongoing harassment. After that, the calls and messages stopped entirely. Yet the fallout extended far beyond phone screens. In a tight-knit community, when an illusion of family authority collapses, word travels fast. Neighbors began watching them with probing looks, and distant relatives reached out with cautious calls, their curiosity thinly disguised as concern. The narrative of a picture-perfect family they had fought so hard to project crumbled completely. What people whispered about was no longer a story of dutiful adult children looking after an aging relative, but a stark account of greed, control, and a failed attempt to seize an estate. Sophie stopped showing up anywhere near my grandmother's neighborhood. On one occasion, my parents drove slowly past the house, as if hoping for a glimpse through the window to offer themselves some comfort. My grandmother stood quietly behind the curtain, watching the SUV pull away without making a move to wave. In the weeks that followed, we poured our energy into establishing a quiet, unshakable routine. Jennifer finalized the irrevocable trust structure, securing my grandmother's assets with complete legal protection. Her true intentions were clearly documented and legally airtight. The vast ranch in Montana was placed into the trust with explicit governing provisions. Every document was executed properly, and every decision was thoroughly vetted. One afternoon, as we sat at the table reviewing the final set of papers, my grandmother looked up at me softly. I should have done this a long time ago. You did it at the moment it mattered most, I replied. She smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that required no performance. I wanted so badly to believe that their care for me would outweigh their self-interest. She murmured, looking toward the window. That wasn't weak, I said, holding her hand. That was just a mother holding on to hope. The APS investigator followed up several times to confirm the timeline and gather additional details. My grandmother answered every question herself, her tone steady and clear. The malicious attempts to depict her as incapable vanished completely under objective review. By the end of the month, the true consequences took hold. There were no dramatic arrests or public headlines, but the professional fallout was decisive. The notary who had accompanied them faced a severe formal review by the state licensing board, as investigators uncovered prior irregularities in other property transfers he had facilitated. Jennifer informed us that his notary commission would almost certainly be revoked, alongside potential fines and civil liability. People like that rarely face prison time for these violations, she explained, but he will be permanently stripped of the legal authority to exploit anyone else. For my grandmother, that was justice enough. My connection with my parents was permanently severed. It wasn't marked by a screaming match, but by a quiet realization. Trust broken on that scale cannot be restored by empty excuses. My father sent one final message, begging for a private meeting with my grandmother. She considered the message for a long time before offering a firm refusal. Not now, she said. If he ever wants true reconciliation, he can start by respecting my boundaries. As for Sophie, she faded from our lives entirely, eventually relocating out of state to Seattle. Perhaps she believed physical distance could erase the reality of what had been exposed. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can carry an overwhelming weight. For me, something fundamental shifted deep inside. I had spent most of my life softening my edges and making concessions just to maintain a fragile family peace, all to keep others from feeling challenged. Watching my grandmother reclaim her independence with absolute resolve taught me a lasting lesson. A peace built on self-suppression and endless compromise isn't peace at all. It's just a slow surrender of your identity. Months later, on a warm afternoon, we hosted a small gathering at the ranch. It wasn't a formal event, just a group of women supporting one another, sharing a meal under the open sky. Laughter echoed across the porch, replacing the quiet isolation that had once defined their lives. Jennifer joined us, having set aside her courtroom demeanor for a relaxed, easy presence. She raised her glass toward my grandmother. "Evelyn, you've built something far greater than you initially imagined," she said. My grandmother shrugged gently, taking a sip of her drink. I simply stopped pretending to be someone they could push around. Those words resonated deeply with me. How many people are labeled difficult or incapable simply because they refuse to be easily managed? How often is age used as a convenient excuse to strip away a person's autonomy? Late that evening, after everyone had departed, I found my grandmother sitting in the old rocking chair on the porch, the very chair where she used to hold me when I was little. I sat on the wooden step by her feet, just as I used to, looking out at the endless horizon stretched before us. "Do you regret not confronting them sooner?" I asked softly. She closed her eyes, reflecting for a moment. "No," she said with absolute conviction. "If I had confronted them sooner, they would have put on their mask of righteousness and acted impeccably. I needed to see what dark truths they would expose when they believed they held total authority and had nothing left to hide." There wasn't a trace of bitterness in her answer, only a raw, unvarnished truth forged through experience. Time moved forward steadily. Our foundation continued to grow, building partnerships with elder advocacy organizations across the country, hosting legal defense workshops, and connecting individuals with top-tier legal resources. Stories seeking guidance flowed in constantly. Some reached victorious resolutions, while others were still fighting their way through complex battles. Yet one thing was certain: not a single one of them had to feel invisible or forgotten by the world anymore. On my birthday, my grandmother handed me a small handwritten note. Folded neatly inside, she had written just one line. "True strength never shouts. It waits patiently until the moment you are ready to stand firm." I framed that note with deep respect and hung it directly above my desk. Sometimes, late at night, I recall the exact moment my family walked into her living room, accompanied by that notary, oozing unearned confidence and utterly convinced they were putting the final touches on their plan. It strikes me how close they came to succeeding, and I often wonder how many vulnerable individuals never get that knock on the door, or the timely arrival of someone to step in before it's too late. That is precisely why these stories need to be shared. It isn't about petty grievances or feeding idle curiosity. It's so that anyone listening might recognize the warning signs of manipulation before irreversible choices are made. If you are reading this and certain details feel uncomfortably familiar, trust your instincts. If someone claims to be stepping into your life solely for your own good while taking away your choices, ask hard questions. If you are being rushed to sign complicated legal documents, stop immediately. If anyone demands that you keep secrets from the rest of your family, turn to an independent professional who has zero stake in your compliance. If you or someone you know has faced a situation like this, remember that your voice carries far more weight than you realize. Sharing your experience might be the exact light someone else needs to see their way through the dark. If Claire's story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her shoes? Where do you think the line falls between genuine family support and overreaching control? Your perspective might be the very thing that helps someone navigating a difficult path right now. If stories about setting firm boundaries, exposing insincerity, and reclaiming autonomy speak to you, stay connected with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join this growing community of thoughtful observers. Silence can offer shelter for a time, but when it matters most, speaking the truth clearly is what changes the outcome entirely.